Let's go Dolphins! I think there's a question every Dolphins fan should be asking right now, and the answer could tell us a lot about where this team is headed over the next few months. Is the offense actually improving? Or are we simply getting caught up in off-season excitement? Because over the last few days, some very interesting developments have come out of Dolphins minicamp. We're seeing more positive reports about the offense. We're hearing coaches emphasize accountability and discipline. Players are beginning to build chemistry. And perhaps most importantly, there are growing signs that certain pieces of this team are starting to come together. Now, before anyone starts planning playoff runs or making bold predictions, let's remember something important. This is still minicamp. The pads aren't on. The real tests haven't arrived yet. But at the same time, you can't completely ignore positive progress when it keeps showing up day after day. And that's exactly why today's discussion is so fascinating. Because if these early signs are real, Dolphins fans may be witnessing the first stages of something that could become much bigger by the time training camp arrives. Before we dive into everything, make sure you've already smashed that like button if you believe this team is improving more than people realize. And today I want to hear from the optimistic side of Dolphins Nation. Drop this comment below right now. Go Dolphins! This team is growing every day. Let's show some positivity and support for the players who are putting in the work during these off-season sessions. Now, my personal opinion is this. The thing that has impressed me the most isn't a specific throw. It isn't a specific player. And it isn't even the salary cap situation. What stands out to me is the combination of growth and accountability. When an offense starts building chemistry, that's encouraging. When coaches demand effort on every play, that's encouraging. When players are being challenged to compete, hustle, block for teammates, and hold themselves accountable, that's when real progress starts happening. You don't build a winning culture overnight. You build it through hundreds of small habits repeated every single day. And based on what we're hearing from inside the Dolphins facility, those habits seem to be getting stronger. But one specific trend involving Malik Willis and the offense has started getting a lot of attention, and it might be the most encouraging development of the entire offseason so far. Let's get into it. Let's fill the comment section with positive energy and show that Dolphins Nation is paying attention to the progress happening behind the scenes. Now, my personal opinion is this. The thing that encourages me most isn't a touchdown pass. It isn't a highlight catch. It isn't even the salary cap update. It's the fact that there seems to be a clear emphasis on growth, discipline, and accountability throughout the building. When coaches are challenging players on effort. When teammates are competing every day. When the offense is showing gradual improvement instead of making excuses. That's the type of foundation successful teams often build before the season ever begins. The biggest takeaway from the latest minicamp reports isn't necessarily one spectacular throw or one impressive highlight. It's the fact that there appears to be a growing consistency within the offense. And that matters. Because throughout the offseason, one of the biggest concerns surrounding Miami has been whether this group could come together quickly enough to establish chemistry before the regular season begins. Now, based on the information coming out of practice, there are signs that things may finally be starting to click. Several plays have generated attention, particularly some of the connections involving Malik Willis. But what stands out isn't simply the completion itself. It's the comfort level, the timing, the confidence, the willingness to make difficult throws. Those are the details that coaches pay attention to long before fans ever see the final result on Sundays. One example that drew attention was a throw from Willis to Malik Washington during minicamp. The discussion surrounding the play focused less on the fact that it was completed and more on the mechanics involved. Willis was able to deliver the football from an unusual body position while maintaining accuracy and velocity. That's the type of trait that can become valuable when plays break down and quarterbacks are forced to create outside of structure. Another completion to Jaylen also generated positive reactions. Again, nobody is claiming these plays guarantee future success. The pads aren't on yet. Pass rushers aren't fully impacting the pocket. Defenders aren't playing full contact football. But there is still value in seeing an offense execute successfully and gradually build rhythm together. And perhaps that's the key word right now. Rhythm. Because football teams rarely become great overnight. Progress usually happens in stages. One practice, one meeting, one correction, one improvement at a time. What's especially interesting is that certain names continue surfacing throughout these practice observations. Greg Dulcich and Malik Washington have reportedly become frequent targets, suggesting that chemistry is beginning to develop naturally between players who are spending more time working together. Meanwhile, there's growing curiosity about how other players such as Caleb Douglas and Chris Bell will fit into the evolving offense as the offseason continues. But while the offensive progress is encouraging, there was another topic that may be even more revealing about the future of this team. Discipline, and specifically, the standards being established by Jeff Hafley. The comments coming from Hafley paint a very clear picture of the type of culture he wants inside the building. Effort is non-negotiable. Accountability is non-negotiable. Playing for teammates is non-negotiable. One detail that really stood out was his approach during film sessions. According to his comments, he actively highlights players who demonstrate effort. Whether it's defensive players chasing the football from the backside of a play or teammates sacrificing individual recognition to help someone else succeed. Those examples are shown to the entire team as the standard everyone should follow. But what makes this approach even more interesting is that the opposite is also true. When players fail to meet those standards, Hafley addresses it. Not through embarrassment, not through public humiliation, but through direct accountability. He asks questions. He challenges players. He wants them to explain their effort level. And in many ways, that can be more powerful than simply yelling at someone. Because once a player has to explain why they didn't hustle, why they didn't finish a play, or why they weren't supporting a teammate, they often start asking themselves those same questions. That's where real culture starts. Not when coaches are watching, but when players begin holding themselves accountable. Another aspect that stood out was Hafley's emphasis on wide receivers blocking for one another. To some fans, that may sound like a small detail. It's not. Those extra efforts often turn short gains into explosive plays. Those extra efforts often determine whether a drive continues or stalls. And perhaps most importantly, those extra efforts reveal whether players are willing to sacrifice personal statistics for team success. That's why I find this story so fascinating. Because while many fans are understandably focused on quarterback battles, depth charts, and roster projections, there's another battle happening simultaneously. A battle to establish standards. A battle to establish habits. A battle to establish identity. And if the Dolphins can successfully build those habits now, before training camp even begins, they may be putting themselves in a much stronger position once the real competition starts. The question is whether these encouraging signs will continue once the players leave for the extended break before training camp. Because that's where the next chapter of this story begins. What makes this situation even more intriguing is that the positive comments surrounding the offense are no longer coming from just one isolated observation. Instead, there appears to be a growing pattern emerging throughout these practices. And that's important. Because one good day can happen to anyone. One good throw can happen to anyone. One highlight clip can go viral and mean absolutely nothing once the season begins. But when positive reports start showing up repeatedly, that's when fans should begin paying attention. The discussion surrounding Malik Willis is a perfect example of that. Several of the practice clips that have generated attention recently aren't necessarily jaw-dropping plays. They're not impossible throws that nobody else can make. What stands out is the comfort level he appears to be developing within the offense. The ball is coming out with confidence. Timing appears to be improving. And perhaps most importantly, he seems increasingly willing to trust what he's seeing and let the football go. That matters more than people realize. Quarterback play is often about confidence. It's about rhythm. It's about trusting the offense, trusting your receivers, and trusting your preparation. And when a quarterback starts finding that comfort level, the entire offense can begin benefiting from it. One of the most interesting observations from practice is that certain receivers seem to be developing stronger chemistry with Willis than others. Greg Dulcich continues appearing in conversations about offensive progress, and Malik Washington has also become one of the names that keeps surfacing